E vamos dar início às palestras do primeiro painel, Política Energética, Expansão da Geração na Era Pós-Hidrelétrica. Recebendo aqui o sócio da Bain Company, em Londres, Julian Critchlow. Julian Critchlow é sócio da Bain no escritório de Londres e líder global de Utilities e Alternative Energy. Ingressou na Bain em 1987 e trabalhou nos escritórios de Londres e São Francisco. Critchlow tem mais de 25 anos de experiência em consultoria e trabalha para clientes globais, particularmente em utilities, setores de engenharia, tecnologia e telecomunicações. Critchlow obteve seu MBA pela Wharton School da Universidade da Pensilvânia. No final da palestra, nós teremos um espaço para perguntas e respostas. Desde já, nossas recepcionistas estarão à disposição para receber as fichas nas quais devem ser anotadas as perguntas. As fichas se encontram nessas pastas que os senhores receberam na recepção ou nas mãos das nossas recepcionistas aqui também. Agora, convidamos ao palco o senhor Julian Critchlow.
Good morning. What I hope to do is to build on the introduction and talk a little bit about the global context of the energy transition. And this, we want to bring some perspectives from what's happened in the rest of the world, in the developed world particular, where the transition has had a very significant impact, and maybe draw some of the conclusions for the faster growth markets like Brazil. The material I'm going to present is based on the work that Bain & Company has done with the World Economic Forum over about the last year and a half, looking at the energy transition. We have a steering committee involved, a large number of the global utilities and also a large number of the technology providers. We've also spent a lot of time with policymakers and regulators to try to understand the challenges of helping the transition to a decarbonized world. I'm going to talk a lot about the European Union, not just because being a Brit, it's my home, but also because the European Union has gone earlier and faster in deploying non-hydro renewables. So the European Union, if you see on this slide, has driven very hard, faster than the rest of the OECD and countries such as the United States, Japan or Brazil. So the European Union offers some interesting lessons about the challenges that we see in making the transition that the introduction referred to. Europe set itself some ambitious targets to hit its Kyoto targets, 2020-20, 20% reduction in greenhouse gases, 20% renewables, and 20% energy efficiency and consumption reduction. We're not doing bad on the first of those, aided a little bit by the financial crisis and the recession, which decreased emissions. We also aren't doing that bad on the second of those. The third, we're probably going to miss a little bit. We're at 16 to 17%, but in general, you would say the energy transition is going well. We're hitting our targets, yes. But we're only about a third of the way through. If you look at the projections for the OECD, we have spent around 3 trillion and still have around 8 to spend. And what we've done in the last 5 or 6 years is to do a huge step up of investment. We've gone from around $190 billion per annum to 290. And we have to hold that level right the way through to 2040 to complete the transition. So the level of investment we've seen in the last 6-7 years is the level of investment we need to see on a continuing basis. And that's in transmission and distribution assets to connect the new renewables. It's in nuclear replacement, but it's also in fossil fuels. If you look at the area at the bottom, the fossil fuels, you can see that there is about 150 gigs of capacity that will be retired over the next 20-25 years. And that will require 100 gigs of new capacity to be able to provide system security and adequacy. So it's not just a transition in renewables, it's an investment in all elements of the electricity value chain. But as we've added capacity, what we've seen in the OECD is a significant addition of capacity. Each of these graphs shows what's happened to demand in the blue, and the capacity in the red, derated, taking account of load factors. And what we've seen in the OECD is a huge addition of capacity, 20-30% over the last few years, in nearly every market, with the exception of perhaps the United States, which has had a slightly more balanced growth, and the UK, which if you extend this graph, there has been quite a lot of retirement since then, so the UK is slightly more in balance. But in general, across Europe, certainly you've had a very significant addition of capacity. And the consequence of that addition is you see very depressed thermal load factors. So where the system was relatively balanced before the transition started, with adding all of that extra capacity, you see the thermal load factors coming down by maybe 20 or 30% in each of the markets. So the most extreme being in the southern Europe and Italy and Spain, but even in somewhere like the UK, France and Germany, you've also seen very depressed load factors. And with that, all that capacity still existing in the market and reduced demand for it, the margins on that capacity have also fallen substantially. So what you're seeing in the thermal generation is very little profit for the incumbent utilities. The consequence of that has been quite dramatic. Oh, sorry, the final element of the story is with a significant increase in the distributed generation in solar, you're seeing the traditional load curve burrowed out in this duck, as it's been referred to, picture, where distributed solar is taking out the center of the day and leading to negative margins in many markets like Germany during the center of the day. And this also creates challenges for the transmission and distribution grids, where you see this potential death spiral where you have a fixed cost transmission grid with a reduced number of units going through it, leading to the cost per unit rising, increasing the cost to people who are not using distributed generation, forcing them to look at distributed generation as well. And that, without being resolved through the regulatory formula, obviously can lead to a situation where in some parts of the world you now have no net flow of units, but you do still have to have the grid as backup for the time when the solar is not producing. So the consequence of all this, why does this matter? When you look at the picture just a few years back in 2008, and you look at the top 10 companies in Europe, North America and rest of the world, you would have seen a number of things. Firstly, the European companies were 2 to 3 times the size of comparable companies in the rest of the world. And if you roll that picture forward, just those 6 years, that blue block has essentially decreased by 50%. The rest of the world has stayed roughly the same. The Far East obviously was very much impacted by Fukushima, but certainly the US picture has actually increased in terms of the market capitalization. So in 6 to 7 years, just a brief period, you've seen a dramatic impact on the incumbent utilities within Europe due to the additional capacity that has been added. That isn't, though, consistent in every geography. It varies according to the geographies. Again, this graph shows the market capitalization across the different markets. And you can see that roughly, they were aligned or followed a similar profile up until the 2009 position on the 2020 targets. And as the transition has occurred, you can see big variations across different markets in the performance of the power sector. And this matters if you are only a third of the way through the transition, you still have 8 trillion to invest. Clearly, the impact that has had on investor sentiment has raised questions around whether the sector is still investable, whether you can still raise the extra 8 trillion that you need to continue the transition. And that's very much reflected in this graph when you look at returns in European utilities and North American utilities. You can see that the incumbent utility returns have come down dramatically over that period. But also, in the green, the renewable players. Those players have also been, the returns have been squeezed as subsidies have come under pressure. And that is in contrast to the US, where you've seen a slightly flatter profile over the time. So this picture in Europe is showing a significant canary in the mine, a warning about the risks of the transition. The final point is that despite the low returns that some of those utilities are now getting in Europe, the picture in terms of pricing is still against Europe. On the left is industrial prices, on the right consumer. If you look at the industrial prices within Europe, they tend to be 50 to 60% higher than, say, the United States. And the share of disposable income that is going to pay your energy bills as a consumer has doubled in Europe over the same period. So we see a picture of very low returns for the utilities and a picture of increasing prices for industry and for consumers. And as a result, when you begin to look forward and you look at Europe has had a very significant share of energy-intensive goods to the export market, and that represents around 24% of employment in Europe. When you project forward, you see that Europe will see significant decline, going from 36% down to 26% over the next 25 years due to the high cost of energy. You also see somewhere like Japan being equally impacted, but interestingly, United States will see growth, as will some of the other fast growth markets. So for Europe, this is a particularly difficult picture. This transition has created a perfect storm in the worst sense. So I want to talk about 3 choices that were faced within that transition and try to learn the lessons from those. On the first was to ask what are the policy lessons that came out of this transition. The second, what are the lessons for market design and regulators? And the third is what are the implications for investors and for businesses? Let me take each of those in turn and start with the policy implications. If we roll back and have a little look at what actually happened in Europe, the first question that asks is what was the public support for renewables? And if you go out and you ask the public across most OECD countries, you actually, they will say 90% of them will say, yes, we would like renewable power. There's a very strong support. When you ask a second question, which is how much would you pay? On average, they would pay 1.5%, 2% extra. And this is clearly a problem when the actual cost of the transition is going to be closer to 10 to 20%. So there's a huge gap between voters' enthusiasm for the transition and their willingness to pay. And this gap is creating a lot of political instability when the costs begin to mount up and the consumer begins to realize what the cost of the transition is. And let's look at that cost and look at the policy situation within Europe. This picture, these 2 pictures, represent the solar and the wind resources within Europe. Pointing out the obvious for somebody who comes from the UK does not have much sun. I go on holiday to get my suntan down in the south into Spain or France. However, if you wish to sail, then you do well to sail around the UK, where we have a lot of wind resources. This picture is known to most European citizens. However, when you look at what we actually did within Europe in our renewable resources, we deployed the solar resources in the north, where there is no sun, and the wind resources in the south, where there is less wind. This is clearly not a good way to pursue your energy policy. That cost the European community a little less than $500 billion to do that. If we had done it the other way round and put the solar panels in the south and the wind resources in the north, we'd have saved about a quarter of that, $140 billion. So this is a very high-cost pathway for Europe to get to its objectives. If you accept the objectives were the right ones in 2020, we could have got there with a lot less investment. What was it about the design of the market that actually encouraged that picture? Well, Europe started out trying to send a signal to the market to put on the right renewables. Carbon pricing was designed to send a clear signal about what we wanted by way of renewables. The target was 20 plus euros. We achieved 5. And this was obviously a factor of allocations, political situation, the allocations, and the economy. But at 5 euros, European utilities have no incentive to build renewables. And in fact, they have an incentive to burn coal over gas because coal is less expensive. So at a time when we're pursuing the 2020 targets, we are actually burning more coal than we have ever done before. So if you're not going to achieve it through a clear market signal, the European nation states decided to intervene in their markets, each independently. On the left, a number of them try to keep the floor below the carbon price. So the UK, France and the Nordics tried to keep a carbon tax or a price for carbon that would signal the right direction. Many more states went into the right and provided individual feed-in tariffs on particular renewables like solar or wind. This did achieve the right objectives, as in it achieved the rollout of those resources. But if you look at an example like Germany, the very high feed-in tariffs that they set for solar attracted a whole set of new investors. So instead of the utilities investing, the grey bit at the top of the bar, you saw individuals putting on solar panels on their roofs. You saw businesses, developers putting up parks. You saw investment funds, sovereign wealth funds coming in and investing in solar. And you saw farmers putting up barns so they could put up solar panels. And if you fly into Germany, you'll be able to see on the approach a lot of barns with a lot of solar panels on them. This was a very successful policy in attracting new investment into solar. So attractive that where we had targeted around 30 billion of spend, we ended up attracting 100 billion. And on the right, where Germany had predicted around 9 gigawatts of solar in their plan, they attracted, in this period, 30, and now a total of around 36 gigawatts of solar. So they overachieved their objectives by about 4 times. A huge amount of money coming into the system. The cost of that, though, to the European consumer is significant. The subsidy bill is now 50 billion plus per annum, of which 23 billion euros per annum is solar in Germany alone to support that deployment. When you compare that to the North American picture, it's substantially less, at less than 10 billion. So the European businesses and consumers are bearing the cost, a very significant cost, of the policies. The impact of all of that is if you have a political unwillingness to pay those costs and those high costs being put through to the consumer, is eventually the piper has to be paid. And within the financial crisis, you saw markets like Spain, Portugal, Greece going back on their commitments to renewables, actually cancelling their support in many cases or retrenching. But even places like the UK, normally a fairly stable investment environment, also closed off their solar scheme, impacting a lot of people who'd gone into solar as a business. So you can see that this political instability and the extra cost that we bore through the transition had a real impact in terms of the stability of investment. And this obviously again impacts the investors' enthusiasm for investing in the future. So coming to the last bubble, what have we seen in terms of the business and investor environment? Well, the traditional model that the utilities had deployed was a classic fossil fuel generation outside of Brazil, transmission, distribution, a billing system, and the customer sitting beyond the meter taking the electricity. That has obviously dramatically changed in the last 5-6 years. To start with, at the customer end, beyond the meter, you see a whole set of investments going in by the customer. 30 to 40% of the investment is going in at the customer's end, not at the utility's end. So you're seeing the distributed generation that I've talked about, the solar as an example. You're seeing energy efficiency moves in terms of lighting and replacement of systems. You're seeing control and flexibility over when people use their power. And you are indeed also seeing electrification of the heat and some vehicles. But a huge amount of investment is going in at the customer's end, way beyond the meter and the traditional utility model. The utilities are left to try and deal with that situation. So they're dealing with the two-way flow of power. They're having to deal with the feed-in tariffs and the flow back in and being able to stabilize the grid. And because of that death spiral that I referred to, they are receiving less and less money to do that. But they're having to reinforce the transmission and distribution grid to take account of both the centralized renewables and the decentralized renewables to be able to keep the grid stable. So there's extra investment, less income for those companies. And at the generation and fuels end, they're having to deal with an increasingly interventionist market and predict what types of generation assets each government wishes to support and deal with those fluctuating subsidies. So the risk has gone up, the income has gone down, their traditional thermal generation is under pressure. It's a much harder environment for the utility sector during the transition. Let me just give you 3 examples of the beyond the meter type implications. The first is a company in the States, Solar City, that has pioneered a business model which is end-to-end, going to the consumer, offering solar, distributed solar on your roof. You give me the roof, I give you cheap electricity. And I will do that by financing the equipment, but purchasing at very low cost and scale. I will consult with you and design your system. I will install it, I will monitor it, and I will manage it. All you do is give me the roof. And this has become a very compelling proposition in a time of rising prices and declining solar costs, such that the US solar industry has grown exponentially. It's growing at about 50% per annum. And Solar City put on 0.5 gig of capacity alone last year and will probably put on 1 gig this year in the United States. So they are a very significant part of this revolution that has occurred completely beyond the utility model. And when you have this complete end-to-end package, you'll see this perfect storm, this ability for suddenly the people to move very quickly to distributed generation. The second business change is around the control. There are companies like Nest that was sold to Google for over $3 billion, which have with a taken a traditional thermostat and made it into a much more attractive kind of iPhone, iPod world of the thermostat, but that allows the consumer to have more control through their thermostat of their heating profile. But it also allows Nest to offer various services. They can offer a demand-side management service where they can take your air conditioning down at peak times and save you money, and you sign up for it, the Nest rush hour service, and you get a rebate for allowing your system to be turned down. They can also automatically help to manage your profile to be able to reduce it when you're away from home and bring it back up, the air conditioning, when you come home, thereby saving you money when you're not there, but having no impact on your comfort level. And they are seeing very dramatic savings as a result of that. So again, this is a company that goes direct to the consumer in many cases, and it impacts the demand on the grid, again reducing the demand. Similar companies, Opower, Centrica just bought a company called Hive. Lots of examples of giving more control to the consumer over their usage. And the third example is, with all this capital going in at the beyond the meter at the consumer's end, you see a lot of energy services businesses beginning to emerge. So these are examples, two examples I picked, Dalkia and Cofferley, started by EDF and Veolia, recently split, and GDF Suez now Energy. And these businesses take ownership of heating and cooling networks, maintain them, install them, improve them, and are already significant standalone businesses, between 9 and 15 billion euro businesses, under the brand and cannibalizing the utility parents that started them. So the lessons that we take from looking at the OECD markets and this early transition from Europe and comparing it to somewhere like North America are in these three areas. On the policy side, there's a need to have stable policy by building the societal support for the investments that you're making. And one way of building that support is to actually have a low-cost pathway, to find the low-cost ways of achieving your objectives. And Europe is an unfortunate example of not having achieved that low-cost route. And that creates instability in the policy. So on the market design side, again, clear signaling to the market on something like carbon helps the market to help itself. If you don't do that, then you have to be very careful about your interventions to create a level playing field for different technologies. If you intervene too much, or as I like to say, one intervention tends to lead to another intervention, you tend to end up with a lot of unexpected consequences, as we saw in Europe. And on the business and investor side, there was a general feeling across the European utilities that the speed of the transition was much faster than originally anticipated. There was quite a lot of new plant built during this transition in the gas, which never opened, because the transition in terms of the renewables caught everybody by surprise. And the fact is that the industry had a lot of contribution to make to the policy debate and the market design debate. And so the conclusions were, for the industry needed to engage more heavily with the policymakers and the regulators to ensure that the transition was done in the correct way. But more urgently, they obviously need to adapt the business models for this new environment where a lot of the capital is going in beyond the meter in the new world. So just to quickly touch on some of the implications, I think many of those implications would still be relevant for Brazil. But when you look at a lot of the developing markets, which we are doing this year, you obviously see a phenomenon where, as the market develops, the GDP per capita grows, you get a lot more consumption. And so you get this double effect of fast growth markets having even faster growth electricity systems, and the unique challenges that brings. And so as you look at projections going forward, you would see that the projections on average, not any particular year, but on average the GDP projections would be much higher in the non-OECD, and the growth, therefore, in the electricity systems would also be much higher than in the OECD. And as a consequence, the levels of investment are also going to have to significantly increase, not just to manage the transition, but to be able to provide the access to the electricity. So huge uplift in the amount of investment, perhaps doubling over the next 25, 30 years of the investment levels. And that in itself raises a whole new set of questions. If you look at the OECD in the blue and a couple of examples, India and China, for the non-OECD, historically the OECD has financed it through private markets, through debt markets, through equity markets, as well as through state sources. But the non-OECD has traditionally been much more through state and government funding. And that funding in debt and retained earnings is going to be challenged to be able to achieve the doubling of the investment. So this implies a much higher level of private sector investment, both within national boundaries and globally, to support the investment, the T&D and the retail businesses, to be able to, at all of those elements, have to be built out at the same time. And clearly there's lots of examples where, for instance, in Brazil, you will need to, for your thermal generation, you will obviously need to develop the source of gas and the supply of gas for those thermal generation to be achievable. In terms of the market structure, again, similar lessons for the developing markets, that you need to have a level playing field as much as possible for technologies. The more you skew it towards a particular technology and intervene on a particular technology, the more unintended consequences you have. And very importantly, the flow of funds through the value chain has to be achieved. And I know Brazil, in the last few months, has had to deal with this issue, but it's an issue that you see in a lot of markets. I mean, India, the distribution companies and the bankruptcy there makes it very hard for you to justify generation investments when your 30 to 40% of it is lost in losses, meaning that your distribution companies are financially challenged. Finally, and probably the most important element on the business and investing dimension, there is a huge need to attract the private investment as well as the public investment. And so the right nature of the public-private partnerships need to be achieved in each of these markets. And it needs to be a level playing field in which the private investors do not feel like there's the bait and switch in terms of the investments. So they must be attracted through having the right investment environment to attract that level of investment from both the national and global investor community. And finally, there are particular challenges in a lot of markets around the skill gap, in particular technologies and the full value chain. So if you are going heavily into solar, for instance, within Brazil, obviously there is a need for a local value chain as well to support that. So these challenges are consistent with what we saw in the OECD, but perhaps with a larger twist around the level of investment that you're seeing in the developing markets. So just to pose some questions for you as you think about the debates in these three boxes. The policy stability gap in Brazil, you would say that the policy has been relatively less stable over the last few years because of a lot of changes, and that is fully to be expected given what you see in many different markets. The question is, how can you achieve the most stable policy and the most stable investment environment? Can you improve the affordability of the system, keep the cost down to make sure that society continues to support the investments? Can you have the right framework to encourage the mix that was talked about in the introduction around the generation mix? And can you find ways of creating institutional stability? There are a lot of governance issues to make sure that as much as possible policy stays stable and stays certain over time. In terms of the market design, there's a real question of what is the right balance between market mechanisms and interventions to create the right market for going forward. How do you remunerate flexible capacity in a world where you have increasing intermittent sources? And how can you continue to integrate a kind of free market mechanisms into encouraging the generation build-out? Finally, on the investor side, there's this real issue of how to make the environment attractive to private and public sector investors, the right equity and debt market profiles. You have to be clear on what roles you want the different investors to play along the value chain. And you need to be clear on what choices you're making to make this a robust and certain investment environment for investors going forward. Thank you.
Nós agradecemos a apresentação do Sr. Critchlow. Neste momento, o Sr. Critchlow irá responder e também comentar algumas questões colocadas por ele. Convidamos aqui o Sr. Alexandre para fazer as perguntas, enfim.
Bom, eu recebi 2 perguntas, então se alguém tiver mais alguma pergunta, por favor, pode entregar para as recepcionistas que estão no fundo. Acho mais fácil fazer a pergunta em português. Ok?
I'll try.
Para não assassinar. Ok. Se o senhor pudesse escolher apenas uma lição global que pudesse ser aplicada ao Brasil, qual seria essa lição?
Sorry, could you repeat?
Se o senhor pudesse escolher apenas uma lição global que pudesse ser aplicada ao Brasil, qual seria?
I think one of the most important lessons is this issue of policy. That if you have good policy, low-cost policy, and you choose the right low-cost routes, then that gives you the best probability of reaching your objectives. If you choose if you allow particular technologies to lobby and end up with specific interventions, then you end up with a very complex and high-cost system. And clearly, Brazil has a set of natural resources which should position you very well in the global economy and support your economic growth. Having said that, as you currently look at, and we look at the projections that I showed in terms of the prices, Brazil has been going in the opposite direction, in a direction of relatively higher cost, and that will imply a very challenging situation for Brazilian business. So I think it's going to be very important to find the right low-cost pathways for Brazil to achieve its energy policy objectives.
Outra pergunta, o senhor sente uma diminuição do humor, apetite de investidores em nível global quando se pensa em renováveis? O Brasil deve apostar em solar e eólica?
I think the appetite of investors for renewables has declined, where the returns in markets like the OECD have declined. But at the same time, the costs are coming down very fast. The projections are that the renewable deployment in the non-OECD will be 3 times the deployment in the OECD. And so that will continue to drive costs down, which means in many cases those renewables become cost-effective without subsidy. If you go to India now, you will be able to put in solar panels and replace a diesel generator without a subsidy because the economics justify a solar panel versus a diesel generator. And so whether Brazil should deploy solar, Brazil has good solar resources. And so as the solar costs continue to come down, I suspect it will be an economic source for Brazil. The question will be making sure that you deploy it in the right areas where the best resources are, and also trying not to put too many costs on the supply chain to ensure that you can access the full global experience curves for the solar.
Uma pergunta do Sr. Christoph. I think it's not necessary you're from the University of Stuttgart. What do you think is the best strategy to deal with the intermittence of renewable sources? How to backup solar and wind energy? How to backup solar and wind energy?
Yeah, the supporting of the intermittent generation is clearly a difficult issue during the transition. Today, you would say that backup sources like a gas peaker are the most cost-effective with a grid to back up solar and wind resources. Obviously, over time, energy storage is becoming increasingly competitive, and you would expect that to cause a second transition when it becomes cost-effective with a peaker. So it depends on the time frame that you're asking about. In the short term, it is likely to be the grid and thermal generation that backs up in many locations, but over time it will likely be storage that will come to be a increasing part of the mix. And clearly where there is no grid, you may find that storage becomes more competitive sooner.
One more question in English. Overcapacity is an intrinsic issue related to renewable energy. Do you have any suggestion on how to minimize this issue? Pergunta do professor José Moreira.
The overcapacity is largely driven by the speed at which we've added in the OECD the renewables to the existing systems, which largely were balanced before we started. So if you add a very large amount of capacity, by definition, unless you remove some old capacity, you are going to have overcapacity. The removal of old capacity has been made more complex by the lack of clarity of whether coal or gas is the most economic source. And so clearly there's, over time, you're seeing the older capacity being withdrawn, and in a market, for instance, like the UK, you see a more balanced system than you see in some of the other markets. But it's going to be a phenomenon when you put on renewables very fast, it goes on faster than you can take off capacity in a flat market like an OECD. In a developing market, it's clearly a different picture. In many cases, you need extra capacity, and that extra capacity can come from the renewables as much as the fossil plant. And that means your system can stay more balanced and the transition can be more managed.
Em português, não. Pergunta do Bruno da EDP. Como a União Europeia resolveu o problema da queda de receita das distribuidoras com a geração distribuída?
Complicated question. Distributed generation obviously raises lots of challenges for the grid system. The first is the net metering that I described, that you can't have the grid acting as your backup for distributed generation but not being paid for by consumers. And you need to evolve the grid charging mechanism to ensure that the grid and the thermal generation that provides backup does get correctly paid for, remunerated, as you grow your distributed generation. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't, distributed generation can contribute to that. It just needs to pay a fair price for the backup capacity. And so there's going to need to be, in all of the geographies, there's a strong debate, especially in North America, in some places like Australia, around what will be the right pricing mechanism for distributed generation and for the, on the other hand, the grid that supports that distributed generation.
Okay. Now, there is a person surprised, not a single word about climate change. Could you comment?
Yeah, the work we were doing with the World Economic Forum was not to question the issue of climate change or to raise, but more to raise the question is, assuming you have a set of objectives from your energy policy around climate change, a balance of affordability, sustainability, and security of supply, those three elements will always be part of the energy policy. It is for the scientists and politicians to debate the right mix of those, but if you have picked a mix, then these lessons are lessons about how to achieve that policy objectives in the best way. So you can achieve any decarbonisation objective in a low-cost way or a high-cost way. And we would obviously strongly recommend that the policymakers look for the lowest cost pathway to the objectives. Now, it was not part of our remit to look at the climate change mix or what mix. As we're looking at the developing markets, we note that there are clearly people who are pursuing only security of supply and affordability, and others who are taking a more balanced profile of sustainability. And clearly that's going to have to be debated in Paris and will have to continue to be debated. But whatever your objectives are, there are good ways of doing it and bad ways of doing it.
Mais alguma questão, Eduardo?
Pode deixar, Alexandre, estou levando lá.
Hello, Julian. Thank you for your presentation. We've seen a lot of comments on distributed generation as a source of intermittence. Are there any studies in Europe or in any other country you've worked on about electric vehicles as a source of intermittence, because they will create another challenge both for the planning and for the operations of the grid? Have you seen any studies or reflections on that?
Yes, clearly the emergence of electric vehicles offers lots of new challenges. Largely, the projections tend to be towards the back end of most periods because of the relatively slow growth. As an electric vehicle driver, I'm a big enthusiast for the technology. But it will offer two challenges for the grid. One is demand. Clearly, large-scale deployment will impact significantly the demand. If you take a couple of cars in an average household, you could easily end up doubling the demand from that household. So from a demand side, it will have very significant implications when rolled out more broadly. Obviously, the storage impact also has a potential impact where it can absorb or flatten the curves over many markets. And the final element on that is that the large-scale deployment, and Tesla is obviously a very well-known example, but that is having a significant impact on the rate of deployment of batteries, which is impacting the battery curves. And therefore, as those scale up, it could bring forward the time when storage becomes increasingly part of the grid.
Mais alguma questão? Acho que tem alguma.
Só um minuto.
Só para controle do tempo, quanto tempo nós temos ainda? 2 minutos?
2 minutos.
Mais uma última pergunta, então. Professor Bajai.
I would like to know if the European Commission is actually trying to coordinate this process of trying to cut down the cost of new renewable energy sources in the member countries of the community of the Union without endangering significantly the target of CO2 reduction in these countries. So the question is a concentrated effort of the European Commission with this issue, or that's just a problem left for each member country?
To ask a Brit a question about the European Union is always dangerous. We presented the analysis that I've shown you to the Maros Sefcovic from the European Commission at Davos. So he was involved in the meeting with the utility CEOs on the discussion. And it was, it was heartening to see that he very much took to heart the messages, that we need to have a more integrated policy. We need to be thinking more across Europe and how we get the best solution for Europe, not just the best for Germany or for England or for Scotland. We have to have a broader, and interconnection is a large part of that. On the message around carbon pricing, again, there was a general acceptance that carbon pricing is clearly not in the place it needs to be, and again driving that towards the direction it was originally intended to be. So on the face of it, I would say the messages are clearly heard and clearly received. On the other hand, I would say that the pace of movement is perhaps too slow still. And the targets they have for carbon pricing is are small and incremental, when really the situation has been very dramatic over the last 6-7 years. So I would say direction, yes, is good. Pace of travel, perhaps too slow. But then I am British.
Uma pergunta no fundo, e com ela nós encerramos a apresentação do Julian.
Onde é? Levanta a mão, por favor.
É uma pergunta bem breve. O desenvolvimento...
Só um instantinho para que o Julian... Ok.
É uma pergunta bem breve. Toda análise é feita em relação à geração distribuída, ela sendo uma geração complementar à geração que já existe hoje. A partir do momento que você tem o desenvolvimento e o barateamento de baterias e você deixa de depender desse backup, isso não significaria um tiro de misericórdia na distribuidora, nas distribuidoras, por exemplo?
It's a good question. The storage will have a big impact when it passes through the economics of the centralized grid. Having said that, it's a question of timing, and that timing is a matter of debate. Our view would be in the 2020s, you will see a significant battery impact of batteries. But for the foreseeable future, being probably the next 10 years, you're going to see that the centralized grid still has the core role to play. When you go into the 2030s, then you will have a different, as I said, a different debate around distributed generation and local storage. The grid, though, will still represent, where it exists, an economic way of sharing that storage or sharing those distributed generation assets. So microgrids rather than macro grids may well have a larger role to play. So I think I wouldn't yet say the grid is dead. I would think it's a long way off that. And certainly for the next 10, 15 years, we are still going to need to have a balanced portfolio.
Okay. Julian, congratulations. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Nós agradecemos ao Julian, agradecemos ao Alexandre. Informamos que teremos um breve intervalo agora, um coffee break, de 20 minutos. Então nós retornaremos pontualmente às 10 horas e 40 minutos. 10 horas e 40 minutos pontualmente. Obrigado a todos.